It didn't start with the trenches. It didn't start with gunfire. It didn't even start with a war declaration. It started with a motorcade, slow, open, and fatal, crawling through the sunlit streets of Sarajevo on June 28, 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary sat beside his wife, Sophie, both dressed in summer formals, waving to a city that simmered with ethnic tension and political resentment. They were warned not to go, told the route wasn't secure, but they went anyway, and in the blink of an eye, a pistol raised, 2 shots fired, the world changed. But what history rarely says out loud is this: the assassination wasn't the cause, it was the trigger. The gunpowder had been packed long before, barrel by barrel, by pride, empire, paranoia, and revenge. To understand why the First World War really happened, you have to rewind not days or months, but decades, back to a continent addicted to expansion, to kings who couldn't back down, to treaties signed in secret, and to a population so accustomed to peace that they mistook it for permanence. The peace of Europe in the early 1900s was not quiet. It was tense, a silence before the avalanche. Great Britain ruled the seas. Germany ruled ambition. Russia ruled vast, crumbling territories. Austria-Hungary ruled over peoples it didn't understand. And France still ruled its bitterness over defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. This wasn't balance. It was detonation waiting for a match. By the dawn of the 20th century, Europe looked stable on maps, but those maps were lies. Beneath them, alliances shifted like tectonic plates. In 1882, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy had formed the Triple Alliance, a pact of mutual support, but also mutual suspicion. France, feeling isolated and humiliated by its loss to Germany decades earlier, found comfort in Russia, forming the Franco-Russian alliance in 1894. Britain, traditionally aloof from continental politics, began to feel the pressure of Germany's growing naval power and colonial ambitions. By 1907, the Entente Cordiale between Britain and France, followed by a looser understanding with Russia, created the opposing Triple Entente. Europe wasn't at war, but it was now split into 2 enormous camps. Each had promised to defend the other, and each believed that the threat of mutual destruction would keep the peace. But that belief, that treaties made war impossible, would prove to be history's most tragic miscalculation. The alliances weren't just lines on paper, they were loaded pistols on the table, and every nation was watching the other's hands. But treaties alone didn't create the war. Pride did, empires did, colonialism did. The late 1800s and early 1900s were the age of imperial anxiety. Britain controlled vast colonies, but Germany wanted more. Germany, a relatively new nation, had emerged from the unification of German states under Prussia in 1871, and it wanted to prove itself, not just economically, but militarily. Its Kaiser, Wilhelm II, dismissed diplomats and favored grand gestures. He believed in strength, in destiny, in ships. He ordered massive naval expansion, hoping to challenge Britain's supremacy at sea. Britain responded by doubling its naval production. An arms race had begun, not just with bullets and ships, but with fear. Meanwhile, Austria-Hungary was unraveling internally. It was a patchwork empire. Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Serbs, Croats, all stitched into a fragile monarchy. Nationalist movements festered beneath the surface. The Slavic populations in particular looked to Serbia, a rising power in the Balkans, as a beacon of ethnic unity. Russia, positioning itself as the protector of all Slavs, supported Serbia. Austria-Hungary feared Serbia, and Germany backed Austria-Hungary. The pieces were now in place, complex, volatile, and ready to fall. In 1908, Austria-Hungary formally annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina, lands heavily populated by Slavs, enraging Serbia and its Russian allies. Tensions soared, assassination plots circulated in whispers. Secret societies, like the Black Hand, trained young men to die for their cause. By 1912 to 1913, the Balkan Wars exploded across southeastern Europe, with Serbia emerging stronger and more confident. Austria-Hungary, in contrast, was aging, rigid, and nervous. The old empires were afraid, not of external enemies, but of their own decay. They saw in war not destruction, but restoration, glory, discipline, unity, a reset. They thought a war might rally the people. That belief, romantic, deadly, and arrogant, was common in Berlin, in Vienna, in Paris, in St. Petersburg, and when Franz Ferdinand was killed in Sarajevo, it wasn't just a royal tragedy. It was a test of alliances, of nerves, of diplomacy. Austria-Hungary didn't act immediately. It waited, it debated. Then, on July 23, 1914, nearly a month later, it issued an ultimatum to Serbia, harsh, unreasonable, designed not to be accepted. Serbia, under Russian pressure, agreed to most terms, but not all. That was enough. Austria-Hungary declared war on July 28th. Within days, Russia mobilized. Germany warned Russia to stand down. Russia refused. Germany declared war on Russia on August 1st. 2 days later, it declared war on France, then invaded Belgium to reach Paris, triggering Britain's entry. The fuse burned faster than anyone expected. What was meant to be a local conflict in the Balkans became a chain reaction, a war of alliances. No one could stop it, not because they wanted war, but because they had planned for it, in detail, in advance, for years. The generals opened their drawers and pulled out mobilization plans they had rehearsed like theater. There was no pause, no step back. The machines had been built, and now they were moving. So why did the war really happen? Because empires feared weakness. Because nations mistook treaties for wisdom. Because pride blinded judgment. Because leaders believed war could solve what diplomacy couldn't. Because military planners forgot the human cost. And because the people, soldiers, civilians, entire societies, were told they would be home by Christmas. But instead, they marched into 4 years of slaughter, into trenches filled with water and rats and chlorine gas, into fields where lives were measured in meters, into a war that didn't need to happen, but did. Not because of a single gunshot in Sarajevo, but because the world had prepared for it so long that it no longer knew how to prevent it. When war officially broke out in August 1914, there were no illusions among generals, only among the people. The commanders had seen it coming for years. They had written the plans, revised them, rehearsed them. Every major European power had a war plan, detailed down to train timetables and supply routes. But the flaw in each of them was the same. They assumed the enemy would behave predictably. Germany's war plan, the infamous Schlieffen Plan, was a masterpiece of confidence. It assumed that if war broke out, Germany would have to fight on 2 fronts, Russia in the east and France in the west. To survive, Germany would need to defeat France quickly, before Russia could fully mobilize. The plan was bold: invade neutral Belgium, sweep through northern France, capture Paris in 6 weeks, and then pivot the army to face Russia. It relied on speed, precision, and the complete collapse of French resistance. But it also relied on one more thing: that Britain, a guarantor of Belgian neutrality, would stay out. Germany believed Britain would protest, maybe shout, but not fight. They were wrong. When German troops marched into Belgium on August 4th, 1914, the United Kingdom declared war. Overnight, what began as a regional conflict had become a global one. dragging in not only Europe's greatest powers, but their colonies, dominions, and overseas armies. On the other side, France had its own vision of how war would unfold. Plan 17, their strategy, focused on regaining the lost territories of Alsace and Lorraine, regions seized by Germany after the Franco-Prussian War. French generals believed in offense, in speed, in elan, fighting spirit. They envisioned heroic charges, rapid movement, and national glory. But what they ran into was not a fleeing German army. It was machine guns, fortified positions, and brutal, precise resistance. The French assaults across the eastern border bled thousands. Meanwhile, Germany's advance through Belgium met fierce resistance from both civilians and the Belgian army. And then came the British. The small but highly trained British Expeditionary Force joined the fight, helping to delay the German advance. The Germans pushed toward Paris, but their timing slipped. Their right flank overextended. Their communications broke down. And on the banks of the Marne River in early September 1914, the French and British mounted a desperate counteroffensive. Taxis were commandeered in Paris to rush troops to the front. For days, both sides threw everything they had into the fight. It became known as the First Battle of the Marne, and it changed the war forever. The German High Command, fearing encirclement, ordered a retreat. They fell back, digging in along a line from the North Sea to Switzerland. The French and British advanced, but only a little. Then they too began to dig. Trenches, meant as temporary defenses, became permanent. Barbed wire was stretched. Artillery emplacements were built. Machine guns set in concrete. What had been envisioned as a swift, mobile war now became a siege of an entire continent. Trench warfare was not just a tactic, it was a symptom of industrial killing, of strategic paralysis, of men trying to survive in mud, blood, and the constant thunder of shells. These trenches became entire worlds, miles long, infested with lice, rats, and the stench of decay. Between them stretched no man's land, a wasteland of craters, corpses, and shattered trees. To gain a few meters meant losing thousands of lives. In December 1914, the first Christmas of the war arrived. In some sections of the front, guns fell silent. Soldiers sang carols, shared cigarettes, even played football between trenches. But it was not peace, it was a pause, a flicker of humanity in a war that would soon forget it. The Eastern Front, meanwhile, was a war of movement, but no less devastating. Russia's massive army mobilized faster than Germany had expected, launching an early invasion of East Prussia. The Germans, under commanders Hindenburg and Ludendorff, struck back hard at Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes, delivering crushing defeats to the Russians. But the vastness of the front, the lack of infrastructure, and the incompetence of Russia's high command meant that progress was slow and brutal. Austro-Hungarian forces fared even worse, suffering defeats in Galicia and the Carpathians. Italy, which had been part of the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, initially stayed neutral. But in 1915, lured by promises of land, Italy switched sides and joined the Entente, opening a new front in the Alps, one of frozen mountains, avalanches, and impossible odds. Back on the Western Front, the war turned into a test of endurance. New weapons emerged: poison gas, first used by the Germans at Ypres in 1915, turned the air itself into a weapon. The tank, invented by the British, promised mobility, but often broke down or became stuck. Flamethrowers, grenades, long-range artillery, all tools in a war that had no clear objective anymore, just the grinding down of human lives. Generals, raised on the strategies of past wars, struggled to adapt. Offensive after offensive was launched, each one promising breakthrough, each one ending in slaughter. Verdun, the Somme, Passchendaele, names etched in horror. The Battle of the Somme alone cost over 1 million casualties for a gain of just a few kilometers. The logic of war had inverted. Success was measured not in victory, but in survival. In the colonies and across the seas, the war spread. British, French, and German forces clashed in Africa. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire entered the war on the side of the Central Powers, turning the conflict into a truly global affair. The Gallipoli campaign, designed by the Allies to knock the Ottomans out of the war, became a bloodbath. Anzac troops from Australia and New Zealand landed on beaches defended by dug-in Ottoman forces. The campaign lasted months, achieved little, and cost tens of thousands of lives. The war was no longer about victory. It was about not losing, and every side began to fear they would run out of men first. What began as a plan on paper, a series of train schedules and optimistic timelines, had by the end of 1914 collapsed into a nightmare of attrition. The belief that war would be swift and glorious was dead. In its place stood the grim reality that modern war was machinery, mud, and madness. The Schlieffen Plan failed, Plan 17 failed, and now Europe was trapped in trenches, in strategy, in pride. No one could retreat. No one could admit defeat. And so the war dragged on, not for weeks or months, but for years, killing millions, breaking empires, and all because the world's most powerful men had convinced themselves that war was manageable, that it would be over by Christmas. But Christmas had passed, and the guns were still firing. By 1915, the war was no longer a matter of military strategy. It was a matter of survival, not just for the soldiers in the trenches, but for the civilians who had become prisoners inside their own borders. The guns thundered hundreds of miles away, but their echoes reached every village and city across Europe. Young men vanished from towns, and with them, labor. Fields went unharvested. Factories strained to keep up with endless orders for shells, boots, bandages. The war ate everything: food, fuel, fabric, flesh. In Britain, rationing quietly began. In Germany, the British naval blockade choked off supplies of grain, coal, and fertilizer. By the winter of 1916 to 1917, the turnip winter, Germans were boiling rutabagas as substitutes for bread, meat, even coffee. Starvation was no longer a possibility. It was policy, delivered through embargo, blockade, and attrition. The idea was simple: starve the war machine by starving the people who fed it. And it worked. But it also bred something more dangerous than hunger. It bred anger. In the streets of Berlin and Vienna, workers protested the price of food. In Russia, where the Tsarist regime had already teetered on the edge of collapse, it sparked revolution. By 1917, the Russian Empire, the largest land empire in the world, began to disintegrate from within. Tsar Nicholas II, detached and indecisive, had led the nation into war with vague hopes of national unity and divine duty. But his army, poorly supplied and catastrophically commanded, suffered enormous casualties on the Eastern Front. Desertions mounted, mutinies spread. In March 1917, after mass strikes and bread riots in Petrograd, the Tsar abdicated. A provisional government took over, promising reform and constitutional order. But it made one critical mistake. It stayed in the war. The Russian people were exhausted. Soldiers abandoned the front. Soviets, workers' councils, began to take power, and by November 1917, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, overthrew the provisional government in the October Revolution. Lenin's promise was simple and electrifying: peace, land, bread. Russia exited the war in March 1918 with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, ceding vast territory to Germany in exchange for an end to fighting. But the cost was more than land. It shattered the Eastern Front. It freed German divisions to shift westward, and it sent a clear message to every collapsing monarchy in Europe: the old order was dying. While the East crumbled, the West groaned under the weight of its own delusions. Germany had gambled that victory would come quickly, that its enemies would break first. But with Russia gone and the Western Front locked in stalemate, Germany made its final gamble: unrestricted submarine warfare. In early 1917, German U-boats began targeting all shipping to Britain, including American vessels. The goal was to starve Britain into surrender before the US could mobilize. It was a race, but it was also a miscalculation. On April 6, 1917, after the sinking of multiple US ships and the revelation of the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany offered Mexico support in reclaiming American territory, the United States declared war. At first, the impact was psychological. American troops wouldn't arrive in large numbers until 1918. But the knowledge that a fresh, industrialized giant was entering the war crushed German morale and stiffened Allied resolve. Propaganda posters shifted. Now it wasn't just about defending Belgium or avenging France. It was about making the world safe for democracy. Back home, the cost of the war became unbearable. In France, villages became ghost towns. In Britain, women filled the roles of men, working in munitions factories, driving ambulances, managing farms. In Austria-Hungary, the seams split open. The empire was never truly unified. It was an arrangement held together by royalty and repression. But war strained every ethnic and political fault line. Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Serbs, all began to demand independence. The emperor, Franz Joseph, had died in 1916 after nearly 70 years on the throne. His successor, Karl I, tried to make peace, tried to reform, but it was too late. The empire no longer believed in itself. By 1918, it was collapsing into its national components, not with fireworks, but with desertions, refusals, and quiet abandonment. The war had not united the empire. It had exposed its fragility. Germany was not immune, though the military still held together. The cracks were visible. In the spring of 1918, the Germans launched the Spring Offensive, a final push on the Western Front before American forces could fully arrive. For a moment, it looked like it might work. German troops broke through in several areas, pushing the Allies back by miles, but they lacked the supplies, reserves, and infrastructure to sustain it. The offensive stalled, and then the Allies counterattacked, with tanks, with air power, with fresh American divisions. One by one, the German lines buckled. The war machine was still running, but now on fumes. And back home, the workers knew it. In November 1918, sailors in the German Navy mutinied rather than sail on a suicidal final mission. Their rebellion spread to Kiel, to Berlin. Workers' councils formed. The Kaiser, Wilhelm II, abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. A republic was declared. The war was over, but not by victory, by implosion. Germany had not been conquered. Its cities were not occupied, but it had run out of time, men, and breath. And yet, even as the governments collapsed, the people still suffered. Spanish flu ravaged armies and civilians alike, killing millions before it vanished. The dead of war were not just soldiers, they were nurses, mothers, children. The war had redrawn maps, but it had also erased a generation, and in the silence that followed, there was no celebration, just exhaustion, regret, and a question whispered by those who had survived it all. What was it for? By November 1918, the war was already dead. The body had not fallen yet, but the pulse had faded. In the final weeks of the conflict, Germany was in collapse. Its army was retreating, its allies had surrendered, and revolution gripped its cities. Austria-Hungary had signed an armistice on November 3rd. The Ottoman Empire had signed theirs on October 30th. Bulgaria was already out. The German Kaiser had fled into exile, and a new civilian government in Berlin was pleading for peace. The fighting was still active along the front, but only technically. Everyone knew what was coming, and yet the blood didn't stop. On November 8th, 1918, German delegates arrived at a train carriage deep in the Compiègne forest in northern France, the private mobile command post of Marshal Ferdinand Foch, the supreme Allied commander. The negotiations were brief. Germany had little room to bargain. The Allies dictated the terms. A ceasefire would take effect at 11 a.m. on November 11th, giving time for the agreement to be telegraphed across battle lines. For the first time in 4 years, the war had an expiration. The clocks were ticking, and instead of ending the killing, some generals ordered one final push. What followed in the hours between the armistice being signed at 5 a.m. and it going into effect at 11 a.m. remains one of the most controversial, haunting chapters in modern warfare. Nearly 3,000 men died in those final 6 hours, not accidentally, not defensively, but by direct orders, for reasons that had nothing to do with military necessity and everything to do with ego, reputation, position, and vengeance. American units under commanders seeking last-minute glory were ordered to cross rivers, storm trenches, and charge machine gun nests, knowing full well the war would end within minutes. French officers, unwilling to allow the Germans to withdraw in good order, sent waves of men into hopeless assaults. British forces pushed forward to capture ground that would be meaningless in a matter of hours. The logic was chilling. Better to die advancing than to sit idle. Better to be remembered as aggressive than passive. In a war that had already consumed millions, this final burst of killing was not strategic, it was symbolic. Private Henry Gunther, a 23-year-old American of German descent, was one of the last men to die. At 10:59 a.m., just 1 minute before the ceasefire, he charged a German machine gun post near Chaumont devant Damvillers. The German soldiers, aware that the war was ending, reportedly tried to wave him off. But Gunther continued forward and was shot dead. His time of death was officially recorded as 10:59. He died 60 seconds before peace. Others died similarly in rivers, forests, trenches, their last breaths taken for ground that would be relinquished hours later. In total, it's estimated that more than 2,700 men were killed on November 11th alone, more than those killed on D-Day, and every death happened after the peace had already been signed. Why? The explanations vary. Some commanders wanted to end the war with a victory, to ensure their names were in the headlines. Others hoped to seize strategic positions before borders were negotiated. A few feared the armistice might fall through, that peace might be reversed, and didn't want to be caught off guard. But beneath all these reasons was something simpler, colder: momentum. After 4 years of endless orders, movements, drills, and attacks, the machine of war couldn't stop on a dime. The command structure was too large, too rigid, too used to killing. And so it did what it always did. It continued. It ground forward. It obeyed its own inertia, even if it meant spilling blood for nothing. When the hour finally came, 11 a.m., the silence arrived like thunder. At the front lines, soldiers who had been firing one moment were suddenly staring into stillness. Guns fell quiet. Birds returned. Men emerged from trenches blinking in disbelief. Many wept. Some stood motionless, too stunned to move. After 1,568 days of bloodshed, the war that had consumed Europe, shattered empires, and redrawn the world, was over. But the cost was carved into every face, every grave, every ruined town. Over 16 million people were dead. Entire villages were gone. Fields once rich with wheat were now graveyards of iron and bone. In the hours that followed, bells rang across Europe. Cities erupted into celebration. Paris roared with joy. London lit up with fireworks. New York streets flooded with cheers. But the front remained hushed. For the soldiers who had survived, joy was not immediate. They had seen too much, lost too much, Many watched the celebrations with hollow eyes. Others turned away. Peace had come, but it had arrived on a schedule, and it had waited just long enough to claim a few thousand more. The war had not ended with a surrender. It had ended with a clock, and that is the final cruelty of the First World War, that after everything, the alliances, the artillery, the endless trenches and treaties and tombstones, it ended not with a final battle or a heroic last stand, but with a calendar appointment, a time on a page. It ended because men with pens said it could, but by then, millions of voices had already gone silent. When the guns fell silent on November 11th, 1918, the war was over, but the reckoning was just beginning. Europe stood in ruin, stunned by the scope of what had happened. Over 16 million dead, empires erased, maps unrecognizable, and no one truly knew what kind of world had survived. For the victors, especially France and Britain, there was celebration, but beneath it, a hunger, not just for justice, but for revenge, compensation, and control. And at the heart of this reckoning stood the question, what should happen to Germany? Should it be forgiven, punished, reshaped? The answer came not on the battlefield, but at a long table inside the Palace of Versailles, a place once built to celebrate royal power, now repurposed to redraw the world. And what happened in that room would become one of the most controversial and consequential acts of the 20th century. Because, while the war may have ended in silence, the peace was written in bitterness. The Treaty of Versailles negotiations officially began in January 1919, but from the start, they were far from fair or united. Germany, the defeated power, was not invited to the initial discussions. Neither were its allies. This was a victors' summit, and the victors were not aligned. France, led by Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, came to the table with rage carved into memory. Northern France had been scarred by years of German occupation, cities destroyed, forests burned, sons buried. Clemenceau had no interest in reconciliation. He wanted guarantees. Germany must never again rise strong enough to threaten France. Britain, represented by Prime Minister David Lloyd George, took a more cautious approach. Britain had won the war, but at immense cost, and its people wanted peace, not perpetual hostility. Still, there was appetite for reparations and territorial advantage. Then, there was U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, the outsider, the idealist. He had arrived in Europe like a prophet, bearing his 14 points plan, a vision of peace without victory, based on self-determination, open diplomacy, and the creation of a League of Nations. Wilson's vision was noble, but Versailles was not built for nobility. What followed was not a true negotiation, it was a dissection. The defeated were carved apart. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, already fractured, was officially broken into pieces. Czechoslovakia was born. Hungary and Austria were now separate. Poland, which had not existed on maps for over a century, re-emerged. The Ottoman Empire was partitioned. Syria, Iraq, Palestine, all handed to Britain and France as mandates, thinly veiled colonial prizes. But it was Germany that bore the brunt. The treaty, signed on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, imposed crippling terms. Germany lost 13% of its territory, including Alsace-Lorraine to France and key industrial areas. It was stripped of all overseas colonies. Its military was limited to 100,000 men. No tanks, no air force, no submarines. The Rhineland was to be demilitarized, and perhaps most humiliating of all, Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war. The infamous War Guilt Clause, Article 231. That clause, a single sentence, would burn into the German psyche like a scar. It read, "Germany accepts the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all the loss and damage." It was not just punitive, it was accusatory, a moral condemnation etched into law. The German delegation, humiliated and excluded from the process, protested bitterly, but in the end, they signed. They had no army to resist, no allies left to support them. Their economy was in shambles, their people starving, and yet the treaty was not designed to rebuild. It was designed to control, to punish, to send a message. France demanded and won enormous reparations, eventually totaling over 132 billion gold marks, payments Germany could never realistically make. The burden was not only financial but symbolic, a constant reminder of defeat. Each installment, each transfer was a ritual of submission, and as the German economy collapsed under inflation and political unrest grew, the resentment deepened. The Weimar Republic, born from the ashes of monarchy, was blamed not only for the defeat, but for the peace that followed. Politicians who signed the treaty were labeled November criminals. The myth took root that the German army had never truly lost, that it had been stabbed in the back by socialists, Jews, and traitors at home. This was not true, but it was powerful, and it would become the seedbed for something darker. Meanwhile, Wilson's grand vision, the League of Nations, was born but stillborn. The U.S. Senate, in a wave of post-war isolationism, refused to ratify the treaty. The United States never joined the very league it had proposed. Without American power behind it, the League was little more than a paper shield. It had no army, no teeth, and no authority to prevent what was coming. Because while the victors signed their peace, the world they created was fragile, bitter, and built on unresolved rage. Germany was not the only nation angry. Italy, though on the winning side, felt betrayed. Promised land during the war, it received less than expected. Japan, which had fought alongside the Allies, was dismissed when it proposed a racial equality clause in the League's covenant, a humiliating rejection that deepened its resentment. The Soviet Union, born from revolution and excluded entirely from the process, watched from the shadows. The New World Order was not united. It was fragmented, triumphal on the surface, volatile beneath. The treaty, in theory, ended the First World War, but in practice it laid the foundation for the Second, because peace is not the absence of war, it is the presence of justice, and the Treaty of Versailles delivered order, not justice. Boundaries were redrawn not by consent, but by convenience. Economies were not healed, they were shackled. Nationalism, wounded by defeat, did not die, it mutated. And in the wounded pride of post-war Germany, a man was watching, a veteran, a propagandist, a believer in myths and revenge. His name was Adolf Hitler, and in the coming years he would use every scar left by Versailles as fuel, for speeches, for ideology, for war. The First World War may have ended in 1918, but the story it began, the grievances it unleashed, were far from over. The ink of the Treaty of Versailles dried quickly, but its consequences bled for decades. When the treaties were signed and the flags returned to their poles, Europe tried to convince itself that it had healed. Parades filled the streets, statues were unveiled, bells rang in churches and schools. But the silence left by war could not be filled by brass bands or speeches. In every country that had touched the front, in every town, village, and street, the war had carved a scar that could not be hidden. The trenches had been filled but not forgotten. The bodies were buried, but the trauma stood tall, walking among the living in broken forms. They were called the Lost Generation, men with empty sleeves and tin masks over what used to be faces, women in black, clutching photographs, children without fathers. Entire communities that had sent out boys in uniforms and welcomed back silence. The war had ended, but it had not released its grip. It lingered, in nightmares, in debt, in unspoken grief. Cities were rebuilding, yes, but behind every brick was a memory that wouldn't let go. The most visible reminders were the soldiers who came home changed. Not all wounds could be seen, but many could. Across Britain, France, and Germany, train stations were filled with men on crutches, men with no eyes, men whose jaws had been reconstructed with metal frames. In cafes, you might see a man sipping soup through a straw because his mouth no longer closed. In parks, children played beside veterans who stared into space, flinching at birds or bells. They had been gassed, shelled, frozen, buried. Many returned with what was then called shell shock, now understood as PTSD, though at the time they were often dismissed as weak. Some were locked away, others took their own lives. The statistics vanished into silence. No one kept full count of the suicides, the collapsed lungs, the sleeping men who never woke up. These weren't on the casualty lists, but they were casualties just the same. And then there were the memorials. From London to Vienna to Canberra, war monuments rose like prayers carved in stone. Names were etched in walls, thousands, tens of thousands, entire generations. At the Meningate in Belgium, 54,395 British and Commonwealth soldiers are listed whose bodies were never found. The tomb of the unknown soldier became a symbol of both national pride and national sorrow. But behind every name on a plaque was a life not lived, a marriage that never happened, a child that was never born, a mother who waited by the window until her hair turned white. The war didn't just kill bodies, it killed futures. It altered the demographic spine of Europe. Some towns lost so many men that women outnumbered men 3-1. Schools had to merge because there weren't enough boys. Farms fell into disrepair. Family lines ended. Time itself bent under the weight of what had been lost. And still, people were told to move on. Governments needed optimism. Economies needed workers. Survivors were expected to become civilians again, to dress in suits and return to desks and fields as if the war had not broken something fundamental inside them. Many tried. Some succeeded. But countless others drifted. War veterans became beggars, street musicians, drunks in alleyways. In Berlin, jobless ex-soldiers sold their medals for bread. In Paris, cabarets grew louder, not from joy, but from the desperate need to forget. In London, jazz clubs played into the early morning, drowning out memories with music. The 1920s would later be called the Roaring Twenties, but for millions, it was the decade of ghosts, ghosts of friends, ghosts of limbs, ghosts of identity. Women too were caught in the silent wreckage. During the war, they had taken over factories, farms, hospitals. They had driven ambulances, built bombs, stitched uniforms. They had carried countries on their backs while the men were gone. And yet, when peace returned, they were often told to step back, to return to kitchens and sewing rooms. But they weren't the same women anymore. Some had lost husbands, fiancés, brothers. Others had lost their innocence or found their strength. The war had awakened something, and it would not easily be put back to sleep. Across Europe, the 1920s saw women demanding the vote, entering politics, changing fashion, reshaping society. But beneath the surface, there was still mourning. A quiet grief that didn't fit the headlines. Children, born into the aftermath, grew up surrounded by stories of glory and images of ruin. They played near craters and learned to read by candlelight during blackouts and coal shortages. They listened to their mothers cry softly behind doors and saw their fathers stare at nothing for hours. These children inherited a world that didn't make sense, a world that preached peace but felt cold, brittle, and hollow. Many would grow up to fight in the next war, not out of ideology, but because war had become the rhythm of their continent. First, their grandfathers, then their fathers, then them. Art changed too. Painters abandoned romanticism. Writers abandoned illusions. The world before the war, the world of empire, order, tradition, seemed like a fairy tale written in blood. In literature, the tone turned bleak, ironic, sharp. Hemingway, Remarque, Sassoon. They didn't write about glory. They wrote about horror, about mud and lice and screaming men who couldn't blink anymore, about the moment you realize your friend's body is still warm, but he's already gone, about surviving something you never truly leave. And through all of it, Europe told itself it had one peace. It tried to believe it, that this had been the war to end all wars, that nothing like this could ever happen again. But beneath the surface, the wounds were not healing. They were fermenting. In the cafes where wounded soldiers sat, in the streets where statues were built, in the school books that taught about victory, a quiet unease settled, because peace had come not through reconciliation, but through exhaustion. The machine had stopped only because it ran out of fuel, and everyone knew, whether they admitted it or not, that all it would take was one spark, one grievance, one man with enough charisma and anger, and it would all begin again. The First World War ended in 1918, but it never truly left. It remained in the bones of Europe, in the names chiseled into walls, in the silence between sentences, in the empty chair at dinner, in the dreams that woke men in sweat 30 years later when another war began. And this time, the fire would burn hotter than anyone thought possible. Before the bullets ever tore through flesh, before the bayonets were fixed, before the poison gas slithered across the trenches, there was a different kind of war already raging, one fought not with rifles, but with ink. From the very first day of World War I, governments knew something that had been only partially understood in the wars before, that truth was dangerous and perception was power. So they built a second battlefield, one inside the minds of their people. Propaganda became not just a tool, but a weaponized force. In newspapers, pamphlets, posters, and silent films, entire nations were taught to hate, to cheer, to mourn on command. Every empire, every republic, every king knew this. If the people stopped believing, the machine would stall. And so, across Europe and beyond, truth was bent into armor, not to protect the soldier, but to preserve the cause. In Britain, the War Propaganda Bureau was founded almost immediately after the fighting began, secretly housed in Wellington House in London, staffed by writers, historians, illustrators, and journalists. Some of the greatest literary names of the day, Arthur Conan Doyle, Rudyard Kipling, H.G. Wells, were enlisted to create stories that would galvanize support for the war. These weren't lies, exactly. They were selective truths. In pamphlets sent across the empire, the British were cast as defenders of civilization. The Germans, on the other hand, were described as barbaric. The Hun, a name dripping with echoes of ancient savagery. Posters showed German soldiers impaling babies on bayonets, burning libraries, raping nuns. These images were grotesque, many were false, but they were effective. They bypassed logic and went straight to emotion, to anger, to vengeance. Germany, too, waged its own propaganda war. The Kaiser's government portrayed the Allies as aggressors, bullies bent on encircling and destroying Germany. German newspapers painted Russia as a backward, brutish threat. France was mocked as weak and decadent. Britain was labeled hypocritical, speaking of freedom while ruling colonies with iron fists. And when the first German soldiers marched into Belgium, the act that brought Britain into the war, German officials claimed they were defending themselves against sabotage and treachery. Atrocity stories, once seen as scandalous exceptions, became standard fare. Truth no longer mattered. What mattered was morale. This manipulation wasn't just for civilians. It extended deep into the trenches. Soldiers received filtered news. Letters from the front were censored. Whole paragraphs blacked out by military eyes. Some were rewritten altogether. A private might describe the mud, the lice, the moans of dying men, only to have his letter returned home stripped of all but cheerful lines about comradeship and courage. Families believed their sons were safe and spirited. Soldiers believed the enemy was a monster. Both sides marched under illusions, crafted by the very governments that sent them to die. And then there was silence, the deliberate kind. Casualty numbers were downplayed. Defeats were spun as strategic withdrawals. The use of chemical weapons, when first deployed, was blamed on the other side. And when soldiers began to break, when they screamed in their sleep or wet themselves under shell fire, military doctors labeled them cowards or malingerers. Shell shock was poorly understood. Treatment ranged from therapy to electric shocks. The official line was always the same: real men don't break. Real men keep fighting. Anything else was weakness, cowardice, treason. Propaganda didn't just twist facts, it created entire myths. Stories were fabricated from scratch and repeated until they became belief. In Britain, there was the tale of the Angels of Mons, celestial beings who supposedly appeared during the Battle of Mons to protect British soldiers. In France, stories spread of heroic last stands by outnumbered troops. In Germany, legends grew of invincible regiments and divine protection. These weren't just stories. They were spiritual armor. When the war seemed unbearable, they gave people something to cling to, something to believe in. But belief, once distorted, doesn't fade easily. When the war ended, many of these lies remained, and they had consequences. In Germany, the idea that their army had never been truly defeated, but had been stabbed in the back by traitors at home, took root. The myth claimed that while brave soldiers bled at the front, communists, Jews, and socialists had betrayed them in Berlin. It was false, but it was repeated in bars, in newspapers, in classrooms. And in the silence left by defeat, it became truth to those who needed someone to blame. That myth would become one of the central pillars of Nazi ideology less than 2 decades later. Meanwhile, the practice of propaganda itself had evolved. What began as wartime necessity became peacetime habit. Governments had seen how easily populations could be nudged, inflamed, pacified. They had discovered the levers of belief, and they would not unlearn them. Mass communication, once a tool of information, became a tool of influence. Posters, radio broadcasts, films, all could be turned towards shaping perception. And in the years that followed, every rising regime, from fascists to communists, would adopt these methods with even more precision. The world had entered the age of psychological warfare, but propaganda was not the only shadow cast by World War I. Atrocities, real ones, occurred on every front. Villages were burned, civilians executed, prisons filled, and while some were exaggerated by enemy press, others were deliberately buried by their own side. The Armenian genocide, committed by the Ottoman Empire during the war, saw over 1 million Armenians killed, deported, or marched to their deaths in the desert. It was one of the first modern genocides, And though reports reached Allied governments, little was done. The war had already hardened hearts, one tragedy more or less barely registered in a world drowning in death. Even the battlefield had changed, from places of honor to theaters of extermination. Poison gas, flamethrowers, machine guns, these were not just weapons, they were psychological instruments designed to terrorize, demoralize, erase. Gas masks became standard issue not just for defense, but for sanity. Soldiers feared not just death, but disfigurement, a slow, choking end in a cloud of green. And when those soldiers returned home, their minds carried those fears back into civilian life. The war had not only killed millions, it had killed certainty. It shattered the belief that humanity was progressing, evolving toward reason and peace. It exposed the fragility of truth, the ease of manipulation, and the dark potential of every government, even democratic ones, to sacrifice honesty for control. It revealed that modern warfare was not about valor, but endurance, not about right, but about narrative. What really caused World War I? Yes, a duke was killed, but more dangerously, nations had already built the machinery to justify blood, not with logic, but with emotion. And when emotion is weaponized, the war never truly ends. It lingers in memory, in myth, and in the next generation who inherits not just the scars, but the stories. When people imagine the First World War, they picture muddy trenches in France, dogfights over Europe, and gas masks in Belgium. But the battlefield stretched far wider than that. This was not merely a European war, it was a global quake that rattled continents and ripped open the facade of empire, from the jungles of Africa to the deserts of the Middle East, from the rice paddies of Southeast Asia to the peaks of the Himalayas. Men were called, or coerced, into fighting a war that was not their own. They wore the uniforms of kings they'd never seen. They died beneath flags they never voted for, and when it was over, the promises whispered to them in the name of freedom and loyalty were quietly buried with the dead. Over 2 million soldiers from the colonies fought for Britain alone. Indian troops served in France, Mesopotamia, and East Africa. African regiments were deployed across the continent and into Europe. The French conscripted hundreds of thousands from Senegal, Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. Even the German Empire drew on its limited colonial subjects, enlisting Askari troops in East Africa who fought with astonishing discipline. These men were not just porters or laborers, they were fighters, often on the front lines, often in the mud and smoke with everyone else. In Mesopotamia, Indian troops died in the thousands under brutal heat and disease. In East Africa, African soldiers endured years of guerrilla warfare in some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. In Gallipoli, the Anzacs, Australians and New Zealanders, charged into Turkish bullets with the same misguided courage as their British officers. World War I was fought with colonial muscle. It was paid for in colonial blood. But it wasn't just the fighting that changed them, it was the realization. The moment the illusion cracked, these men had been told they were part of something greater, that by fighting for the empire, for the crown, for the republic, they were earning their place in a world that respected honor and sacrifice. They were told that loyalty would be remembered, that courage would be rewarded, that when the war was over, they too would share in the peace. But the peace never came, not for them. In India, returning soldiers found themselves back in a land still ruled, taxed, and policed by foreigners. The British Raj did not loosen its grip. In fact, it tightened it. In 1919, just 1 year after the war, British troops opened fire on a peaceful crowd in Amritsar, killing over 300 men, women, and children. The Jallianwala Bagh massacre shocked the world, but to many Indian veterans, it was a bitter confirmation. Their service meant nothing. The empire they had bled for did not see them as equals. It never had. In Africa, the story was similar. After the war, Germany's colonies were carved up and handed over to Britain and France as mandates, essentially colonialism under new management. The Africans who had fought in German East Africa or carried supplies for the Allies were not given independence or even recognition. Instead, they were taxed, drafted again, or left to rot in villages stripped of young men. Their reward for war was silence. The Middle East fared no better. Perhaps nowhere was the betrayal more personal or more explosive. During the war, the British had promised the Arabs independence if they rose up against the Ottoman Empire. Leaders like Sheriff Hussein of Mecca believed these promises. They led revolts. They sabotaged Turkish railways. They died by the thousands. Lawrence of Arabia became a legend not because of his heroism alone, but because of the trust the Arabs placed in him. A trust he and the empire behind him ultimately shattered. For while the Arabs were dreaming of freedom, the British and French were secretly carving up the region in the Sykes-Picot Agreement, a cold, bureaucratic plan to divide the Middle East into zones of control. When the war ended, the Arab rebels expected nations. What they got were mandates, occupations, and foreign flags. The disillusionment ran deep. From Cairo to Calcutta, from Nairobi to Damascus, something had changed. The spell of empire, the belief that the colonizer was invincible, benevolent, or destined, had begun to crack. These weren't just philosophical shifts, they were emotional ruptures. For the first time, colonized people saw the European powers at their worst, not just in how they treated enemies, but how they treated their own. They saw generals waste lives by the thousands. They saw cities reduced to ash. They saw men in top hats draw lines across maps with no regard for those who lived beneath them. And they asked, if this is civilization, what are we fighting for? World War I did not cause decolonization, but it lit the fuse. It planted the seeds of rebellion. It raised a generation of fighters who had worn a uniform, held a rifle, and tasted the world outside their villages. These men would not forget. In India, many veterans joined the growing nationalist movement. Some became bodyguards for Gandhi. Others joined radical groups that sought to overthrow the British altogether. In Africa, returning soldiers became the backbone of early political movements, demanding rights, land, and dignity. In the Arab world, resentment toward the West would evolve over decades into revolts, revolutions, and eventually the reshaping of entire borders. Even in places like Vietnam, the effects were profound. A young man named Nguyen Sinh Cung, better known later as Ho Chi Minh, traveled to France during the peace talks. He tried to deliver a petition demanding Vietnamese independence. He was ignored, dismissed, but he remembered. He watched the hypocrisy of the West and would spend the rest of his life fighting to liberate his country from it. And what of the empires themselves? World War I was the beginning of their end. The Austro-Hungarian Empire disintegrated. The Ottoman Empire collapsed. The Russian Empire was consumed by revolution. Even the victors were wounded. Britain emerged victorious but strained. France was bled dry. The United States, while powerful, would retreat into isolationism for a time. None of the old powers came out of the war unscathed. They had won on paper, but beneath the ink, their authority was crumbling. What really caused World War I? You could say nationalism, militarism, alliances, assassination, but peel back the layers and you see something deeper. A world built on domination, shaken by its own contradictions. The war exposed those contradictions, and the people who had been ruled for centuries began to ask louder questions. Why should a king in London decide the fate of a farmer in Punjab? Why should a soldier from Senegal die for a country that sees him as less than human? Why should a desert rebel trust a government that lies in every letter? The war didn't just end with treaties, it ended with doubt, with the slow grinding erosion of empires. And in that erosion, the 20th century would find its shape, not in the marble halls of Versailles, but in the crowded, angry streets of Cairo, Delhi, Nairobi, and Saigon. The First World War shook the world, but it was the people on the margins, the forgotten soldiers, the colonized millions, who would carry its aftershocks into the next battles. Battles not for empire, but against it. When the First World War ended, the killing stopped, but the collapse had only just begun. The battlefield went silent, but in the streets, in the parliaments, in the broken homes and breadlines of Europe, a new kind of war began to brew, not between nations, but between ideas, between systems, between rage and ruin. The map of Europe was redrawn, but what replaced the old empires wasn't peace, it was a vacuum. And into that vacuum poured ideologies louder than reason, more seductive than democracy, and far more dangerous than any bullet fired in the trenches. The world hadn't just survived a war, it had shattered its own foundation, and when people looked down they saw only chaos where certainty used to live. Germany was perhaps the most volatile. The empire was gone. The Kaiser had fled. In his place stood the Weimar Republic, a shaky, exhausted experiment in democracy, born not from victory but from armistice and humiliation. The Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919, and with it came reparations so steep they didn't just demand money, they demanded national dignity. Germans were told they alone were guilty for the war. Their military was disarmed, their colonies taken, their pride shredded. In the cafes and cabarets of Berlin, people debated freedom, sexuality, revolution, but outside in the streets, there was hunger, inflation, violence, paramilitary gangs with armbands and rifles, veterans who had seen too much and earned too little, men with no jobs, no hope, and no future. In that bleak fog, radicalism didn't just rise, it screamed. Communists and fascists battled in the streets. The far left promised revolution, the far right promised restoration, and in beer halls, a former corporal named Adolf Hitler began turning speeches into weapons. He didn't speak of peace, he spoke of betrayal, of vengeance, of the stab in the back. He didn't just blame the Allies, he blamed Jews, Marxists, intellectuals, anyone who didn't fit his vision of national purity. For a population bruised and searching for meaning, this wasn't just rhetoric, it was a lifeline. Hitler offered not truth, but certainty, and in the ashes of war, certainty felt holy. But Germany was not alone. In Italy, disillusionment fermented like rot in a barrel. Though technically on the winning side, Italy felt cheated by the post-war treaties. The promises made by the Allies of land, of respect, of parity were broken or diluted. Italy had spent, bled, and lost for what? A fractured nation still poor, still unstable. The liberal government flailed and the people turned away. They wanted strength, order, glory. Enter Benito Mussolini, a former socialist who reinvented himself as the prophet of fascism. With black shirts and fists, with marches and myth, Mussolini seized power. He didn't wait for permission. He declared that the old world was dead and the new one would wear boots. In Russia, the collapse was even more violent. The Tsar was gone, executed in a basement with his family. The war had broken the back of the empire, but the revolution had severed its head. Out of famine, mutiny, and rage came the Bolsheviks. Lenin, like the others, promised a new world, but his would be classless, godless, and global. The Russian Civil War raged, millions died, and when the smoke cleared, the Soviet Union was born. Not as a beacon of peace, but as an iron machine, forged in paranoia and blood. Communism became a religion of the state, Dissent became treason, and while the West celebrated its fragile peace, a red tide was rising to the east. What really caused World War I? Some say it was the assassination of a duke, but perhaps the real answer is this: the world was already dying. The monarchies were rotting, the empires were hollow, the social fabric was thin. The war didn't destroy stability, it exposed how little of it there ever was, and in that exposure the people saw something terrifying. No one was in control, not the kings, not the generals, not the gods. And so they reached for anything that promised control, even if it came with chains. The 1920s and 30s became a laboratory for extremism. Spain descended into civil war. Japan turned to militarism. France and Britain clung to fading illusions of global dominance. And Germany, defeated, angry, rearming, watched and waited. The seeds of the next war were already sprouting in the gardens of the last. The horror of the trenches was not a deterrent. It was a blueprint. A generation had learned that violence moves history faster than compromise, that lies are louder than facts, that fear is a tool, and truth a casualty. Propaganda returned, not as support, but as gospel. Schoolbooks were rewritten, enemies were named, histories were erased, uniforms returned, sharper, darker, more theatrical. Entire populations were taught to worship symbols, to distrust thought, to march, and those who resisted, labeled traitors, silenced, exiled, or worse. The irony was brutal. The war to end all wars had done the opposite. It had trained the world for a better war, a bigger war, a war not just of soldiers, but of civilians, not just of trenches, but of skies, not just of nations, but of ideologies. Fascism, communism, nationalism, all were born or reborn in the rubble of 1918, and they didn't just survive, they thrived because they spoke to the pain the world refused to name. When millions looked back at the First World War, they didn't see meaning. They saw waste, betrayal, emptiness. The generation that followed didn't want peace. They wanted purpose. They didn't want diplomacy, and they wanted revenge. And when leaders emerged who gave them those things, no one asked what it would cost. Not yet. The war was over, but its shadow, long, dark, and patient, was only just beginning to fall. They said it would be over by Christmas. They said it would be fast, a decisive strike, a parade of banners, a war to secure peace. But World War I became something else entirely, something darker, something no one expected and everyone underestimated. It didn't just change the borders of Europe, it changed the human psyche. It shattered illusions about progress, about order, about who controls history. Before the war, the world marched to the rhythm of empires. After it, nothing marched the same. For 4 years, the earth was scorched by shells, lungs filled with gas, oceans with corpses, and minds with ghosts that would never leave. And yet, after all that death, the world still did not understand what really caused it. Because it wasn't just the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. That was a spark, but it didn't ignite a pile of leaves. It exploded a century of buried explosives. Europe was already a powder keg. Nations were addicted to honor, obsessed with prestige, and tangled in alliances no one could fully control. Armies were itching to prove themselves. Generals were drawing up plans for a war they assumed would end in weeks. Political leaders believed in strength more than wisdom, in empire more than empathy, and underneath it all, there was a terrifying truth no one dared speak. The modern world was already broken. The war didn't cause the breakdown, it exposed it. And what followed, in the silence of the armistice, was not healing. It was erosion. The war had been global, but the peace was national. Every country grieved alone. Veterans returned home to hollow applause and empty promises. Entire generations were marked by loss, of brothers, of limbs, of belief. People looked for meaning and found none. The poets called it the lost generation. But what was really lost was faith. Faith in progress, in diplomacy, in humanity's ability to avoid madness. This disillusionment didn't fade, it metastasized. The war taught people that violence works, that if you shout louder than the truth, you win, that if you offer fear instead of facts, people will follow. Fascism learned this. Communism learned this. The architects of World War II learned this. And when that next war came, just 2 decades later, it wasn't a surprise. It was a continuation, a louder scream echoing from the whisper of a failed peace. And yet, we still ask the same question. Could it happen again? History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. The triggers may change, the names may differ, the flags may look new, but the patterns remain. Rising nationalism, disinformation, political polarization, economic despair, distrust in institutions, the erosion of truth. These are not just modern anxieties. They were the drumbeats of 1914. When people feel unheard, they cling to extremes. When nations feel humiliated, they reach for swords. And when the world believes that war is impossible, it becomes inevitable. World War I wasn't just a failure of diplomacy, it was a failure of imagination, a failure to believe that civilization could collapse so quickly, that neighbors could become enemies so easily, that the veneer of peace could be so thin. The leaders of that time didn't intend to start a global cataclysm, but once the machines started moving, once the alliances locked into place, once the telegrams flew and the trains rolled out, no one knew how to stop it. The world sleepwalked into disaster. That's why we study it, not for nostalgia, not for blame, but for warning. We live now in a world that still carries the scars. The Middle East was carved by that war. Eastern Europe was redrawn by it. The seeds of fascism, communism, and modern authoritarianism were planted in its soil. The very concept of total war, where civilians are targets and ideologies are weapons, was born in its trenches. Every modern conflict carries traces of 1914, whether we see it or not. And so we ask again, what really caused World War I? It was fear, dressed as pride. It was arrogance, pretending to be strategy. It was human emotion amplified by steel, by telegram, by bullet. It was the belief that war could be controlled, that bloodshed could be calculated, that history would follow the map drawn by generals and kings. But history doesn't obey, it devours. The war ended over a century ago, but the echoes are still loud. And as long as we forget what truly lit that fire, not just a bullet in Sarajevo, but a world ready to burn, then yes, it can happen again. Because history isn't locked in museums. It lives in choices. It lives in silence. And sometimes it waits patiently for us to forget.